Carmody is a neuroscientist, and he works hand in hand with Father McCarthy to relate how our brain works together with what Father McCarthy has been saying, and I think you'll find it very interesting. And I forgot to mention this morning that Father McCarthy's, for those of you who weren't here last night perhaps, Father McCarthy's wife, Mary, is here with us too, and we're very glad she's here. John, it's all yours.
Well, this probably wasn't imaginable until you heard Father McCarthy's lecture. So if the entity that brought the universe into existence says, love one another as I have loved you, and that love is completely devoid of any sense of violence or aggression, retaliation, revenge, etc., this starts to make sense. You know, forget survival of the fittest. It is kindness that counts. Now, where did the word survival of the fittest come from? Did it come from Darwin? No. Did it come from an English philosopher? Yes. Actually, Darwin only used that phrase twice, and he apologized for using it the first time, and it still appeared again. So Darwin, in all his research, looking at primarily mammals as well as other organisms, but this part is focused on the conclusions that he came as the result of listening to the intense care and kindness and compassion that mammals gave to their offspring. So it transcends the kind of care that other lower animals actually initiate toward their offspring. And so when Darwin talks about survival of the fittest, he's talking about the ability of offspring to not only survive, but also to thrive. So what's the difference between thriving and surviving? Well, there's a great deal of difference. Just being alive is one thing. Being alive enough to experience the fullness of what it is to be alive, with all the capacities that we have as human beings, all these innate capacities that come with the mammalian brain that we're born with. So we're really talking about 30 million years of development of the genes that we have on our chromosomes up to this present moment in time. There is a tendency, because of the pronounced effect that Hobbesian evolutionary psychology has had on thinking today, primarily in the media and among the military and among individuals and groups that are actually proponents of violence and aggression as means of achieving ends. So with agape, the means become the ends in embryo. So if you're kind and caring and compassionate, then the ends of that particular behavior are going to be the elicitation of kindness, care, and compassion by the individuals you're interacting with. And I'm really talking specifically about the first 3 years of life as far as the child is concerned, and the experiences that child has that determine the structure and function of the brain. So you can change the nature of what it means to be human just by early developmental experiences that the child has. So the brain, from the time it begins to function as an organ until the time you die, remains plastic. That is, it can always change. So when we hear put on the mind of Christ, we're not talking about putting on the mind of Napoleon. We're not talking about putting on the mind of someone that's a Marine platoon commander in Vietnam. We're talking about putting on a mind that's consistent with agape. And theologically, there are three primary components of agape. One is the willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation. So as soon as you believe that, then you have to forget about the whole idea of using any kind of aggressive means in order to achieve an end. It's also the willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation. So I don't need a $10 billion salary every year to be a good corporate executive. while people in my corporation are getting $7.25 an hour and have to work 2 jobs other than the one that they have with me in order to just survive. So there are some dynamics that are going on here that are extremely important, and we'll explore a lot of those this afternoon in the second presentation, but also get a start on it in this morning's presentation. There. All right. Nature or nurture. So there's a perception now that nature, in some people's minds, dominates the way human beings are going to interact with one another. So we have a human nature. That is, if we give the brain what it needs in order to develop, that we'll have a certain nature, and that would be X. Now, the key there is if we give the brain what it needs to develop the way it should develop, literally, which is putting on the mind of Christ, because if you look at neuroscience today, they say literally that the primary default responses of the human brain to other people in the society that they're living in are care, compassion, kindness, understanding, mercy. Nothing in the realm of violence or aggression. So, I mean, this is what the neuroscientists are saying. And some of that first diagram came from an article that was written by a researcher at the University of California at Berkeley. And he wrote an extensive article that was published in Nature Neuroscience, which is one of the big top neuroscience journals in the country. And he was talking about a number of ways that the brain can be influenced by the environment that a person is immersed in. So we're going to just spend a few minutes on this nature versus nurture component of development. So this is a strand of DNA. They call it a double helix because it's like 2 strands intertwined with one another. And in that DNA, if you look at these, let's say we look at this section of the molecule right here, this short chain of that molecule could actually encode for a specific protein. So this is what all the DNA does. It just tells the cell how to put amino acids together, which are the building blocks of proteins, in order to make specific proteins that the body needs. So the proteins are the big regulators in the body. So in order to do that, this code must be copied, and then there's a mechanism outside the cell where the protein is actually synthesized. So if you interfere with what's going on here, then that gene will not be expressed. If the gene was not structured the way it should have been to begin with as a result of some genetic deformation in the developmental process, then it wasn't there to begin with. But they have found that human beings, by the way they interact with one another, can actually change the expression of a gene. So let's say that this gene right here was necessary in order to respond appropriately to a stressful situation, and then, if in fact the stressful situation has been managed, that you could come out of that high stress condition. They have found that children that are abused or neglected have a higher rate of suicide when they are in their teen years and adolescent years. Okay? So what happened when they first started thinking about this, the initial research was done in rats, and they found that rats that licked and groomed their offspring a lot had offspring that were very calm and very social. So they were able to get along with other pups that they played with during the day. And then they found that, well, this was transgenerational. So when those pups grew up and they had offspring, that those offspring were the same, much different from some of the other rats that were in the study that were not raised in thriving environments that included lots of licking and grooming, touching, and things like that. So then they started looking at, for example, stressed teenagers, adolescents. And then they started looking at the possibility that some of the things that were going on early in their life might have an effect on their proclivity to actually commit suicide. And so they got a cohort of brains of adolescents who had committed suicide. They did the brain slices, and they actually found an area of the brain, which is the hippocampus, which is the area of the brain that starts the initiation of memory. So memory is encoded, and then it's actually stored, consolidated in a higher part of the brain. So this hippocampus is in the lower part of the brain, and it has to have like these little receptors in it that when they sense a high level of cortisol in the blood, which is a major stress hormone. So when someone gets stressed out, they have this hormone in the blood. If that stays at high levels, it's actually toxic to the brain. It will actually kill parts of the brain. It's toxic to the nerve cells in the brain. So over the life of this child that's been abused and neglected, they have these high levels of cortisol, which really impairs brain development. So not only are they more sensitive to going into a stressful response, but it takes them longer before they actually get out of that stressful response. So what they found was that the brains of the adolescents who had committed suicide had fewer of these receptors that turned off the stress response. So developmentally, they were unable to control their depression, unable to control their sense of not being worthwhile, et cetera, et cetera. So the dynamics of the environment that the individual is raised in, particularly in those first 3 years, will hold sometimes through the entire life of that child. So this is important. So this is important primarily if you look at, for example, when I was in Vietnam and I was looking at what were happening to the children, looking at what happened to the grandmothers and grandfathers and the homes and the rice paddies and all the destruction around these young children. Not only were they being killed and burned, but they were being left without parents. They were being left without grandmothers and grandfathers. They were being left without homes. They were being left without food supply. They were being left without their water buffaloes. They were being left without their chickens. I don't know if you've heard about the latest book that was written by an author who did extensive research on the militarization of Vietnam by the United States. His name was Nick Terse. And the title of the book is Kill Anything That Moves. The word on the ground for some of the troops, for some of the units in Vietnam was literally that, kill anything that moves. So they could come into a village unprovoked, kill every chicken, every cow, every water buffalo, destroy the rice paddies, kill women, children, grandmothers, grandfathers, etc., and leave the village and say, mission accomplished. So what kind of mind do you have to have if you're willing to participate in that? And a lot of the troops weren't willing to participate in it because we have a chain of command in the military that if they don't obey a direct order, let's say I'm a platoon commander and I give them a direct order to fire at that village or call in an airstrike and the chopper comes in and sprays machine gun fire and rockets on that village, he's got to obey my direct order. If it's someone on the ground and they refuse my direct order, I am authorized to actually kill that person. Just like in World War II, the penalty for not reporting to duty if you were called to join the German army was decapitation, that your head chopped off. That's an incentive to join. So this is what we're talking about, with the violence and the threat and the aggression, getting people to participate in experiences that are causing them severe brain damage. Now, when you're going to Iraq and you have 3 tours of duty there, and then you start in Afghanistan, you have 2 tours there, 3 tours in Iraq. Can you imagine the stress that individual is under? And a lot of them were coming back and they were reporting, the problems that they were having, psychological problems. And so the primary function of the psychologists in the military, as it's always been, is force multipliers. So we want to get this guy back out in the field. Let's get him back out there. So even though they weren't ready to go back, they'd send them for another tour to Afghanistan, then maybe 3 tours to Afghanistan after they already had 2 tours in Iraq. So you have 5 some of them 6 or 7 tours of duty in the period of those 2 wars. Now that is asking for severe brain damage. There's just no way you can have those high stress levels that are involved in combat situations, or just being away from home and being in a foreign environment and not having a safe place to go day in and day out. You're always under threat depending upon what kind of unit you're in and what your mission assignment is. So when those guys come back, their brain structure and brain chemistry has changed. There's absolutely no way around it. There's no way around it, because the brain is an internal reflection of the external environment. And we'll talk about that. The way your brain is set up, the molecules that are active in that brain, the neurons that are active in that brain, the neurohormones that are active in that brain, the ions that are active in that brain, the processes that the neurons are undergoing in order that they can develop and have functional neural networks primarily involved with memory, muscle memory, cognitive memory, et cetera, behaviors. These are not functioning the way they need to be. And so there's deprivation as far as the ability to become the mind of Christ. It seems the most dissonant thing you can imagine is to put on the mind of Christ after you've been all through this and your mind is like scrambled. And you've had brain destruction as a result of all this stress that you've been exposed to. So the question remains, nature or nurture. So let's just take a look at a couple of things that are known. One is that the line between nature and nurture has dissolved into experience-dependent neuroplasticity. So my brain changes in response to the experiences that I have. So if you go back to the gatherer-hunter communities, they used to call them hunter-gatherers, but they found out that most of the time was spent gathering. They weren't running around with spears chasing each other and trying to kill them. They were gathering crops and gathering things they needed to sustain the family. And during this period of time, which was 99% of our existence, there was almost never any individual killing. So if I'm a human being, a Homo sapien sapien, and you're a Homo sapien sapien, that means we are conspecifics. We are members of the same species. There is no species in existence in the entire world, as we know it today, the Earth, that kills a conspecific intentionally. I mean, you see movies of elk, running together and crashing into one another, and you see piranha whipping their tails and having their little skirmishes, and you see rattlesnakes wrestling with one another. But it's never to the death. It's never to the death unless, it's almost like accidental, like, it was a hard headbutt that, I don't know, just for some reason there was a problem with the other elk and his skull fractured and he was killed. But this is unheard of in the animal kingdom. Killing of conspecifics. And we have developed the most sophisticated mechanisms imaginable for doing that. So the neuroplasticity, that means that the brain can always be changed. And you know that if you've learned how to type. You've learned that if you learned how to hit a fastball. You've learned that if you know how to shoot a foul shot without, freaking out because of the pressure. It's the shot that's going to win the game. I mean, there's a lot of stress there. But if you do that enough, then you know how to manage that. You actually can bring down your blood pressure. You can increase your concentration. You can breathe. That helps to relax. So there's a number of different mechanisms that we have. And all these get built into the brain. And the more we do it, the more the brain changes to reflect the pattern of activation that was necessary in order for the person to keep his arm relaxed so he could put enough spin on the ball and flick his wrist hard enough in order to make the foul shot. So until the day we die, we're plastic. So you can always change, always room for change, and the brain will accommodate that. as long as there's patterned, repetitive kinds of training that go into that, or activities. So the more you're empathic to other people, the more those areas of the brain develop. There are 10 areas of the brain now that have been identified as sources of empathy in human situations. So that the more empathic you are to other people, the more frequently you do that, the more those areas develop. And now that we have this wonderful technology called functional MRI, you can actually go in and look at someone's brain and expose them to different situations and see how they manage it. And there's a difference because developmentally, you can see that there is activity in certain areas of the brain for someone that has been in, like they have an induced stress response. In other words, the person is having an MRI, so they do something that's stressful to that individual, and they're looking to see what happens. And so there are certain areas of the brain that light up as a result of that. And they found that, people, for example, that participate in breath awareness or mindfulness meditation or centering prayer, actually those areas become more developed than they are in a normal individual. And as a result of that, the response, to that stress is different. And that can actually be recorded live by looking at a functional MRI. It doesn't measure directly. It just measures the flow of blood into an area, which is equivalent to increased neural activity. Because the fMRI is really measuring electromagnetism, and oxygenated blood has a different response in an fMRI than unoxygenated blood. So they can tell the difference between a blood cell that's bringing in oxygen versus one that's taking away CO2, or carbon dioxide. Next, we have early life experiences determine core neurobiology. Now, no one knows this better than the American Pediatric Association. So they actually say, until a child is 2 years old, they recommend no screen time. This includes iPad, iPod, iTouch, iPhone, any of those devices that have a screen. Because the vast majority of the brain for young infants and children is devoted to social experiences. And an iPad is not a social experience, nor is an iPhone, nor is a television screen. It demands intense human interaction with other persons. This is why when they look at the gatherer-hunter societies, they find that there's extended families, that one child may be nurtured by 20 or 30 different individuals. And since the collective is primarily interested in cooperation, and there's not this dissonance that you get when some people are trying to maintain, their fiefdom or their wealth, because there was no such thing. The crops grew, and then they ate, and then, the next round of harvest came in. And there wasn't massive storage like eventually happened with the advance of culture and technology. But what they're talking about here in the early phases of, not even an early, but we're looking at 30 million years. For most of that time, it was intense cooperation, because intense cooperation was necessary in order for the whole band to, in fact, survive. Now it's not. I mean, we can have our home and we can have our wealth, and we don't really daily, constantly think about someone like, for example, if you have a grandson or a granddaughter and you see someone on the street and this mother's foraging for food and her little 2-year-old's hanging on to her leg, you don't have the same response to that. I mean, you may feel empathic. So there's the feeling of empathy, but empathy also includes actually doing something. So if, in fact, you knew that there was a shelter that could rectify that situation or improve it a little bit, and you went that step, that would be a true empathic act. And an area of your brain, one of those areas that's involved in empathy, actually then has a greater capacity to not only do that again, but possibly think of ways to do it better or do it more thoroughly. So interactions with caregivers during early development establish the brain's cognitive, that is the intelligence part, but also the emotional circuitry. So you're hardwiring your child's brain as you nurture them. So you're building neural circuits. So what happens if you don't do that? What happens if the infant doesn't get the stimulation that he or she needs? Well, one of the classic examples of that are the Romanian orphans. And some of those orphans were adopted by Americans. And there was one case I knew of that was I knew about the whole thing because there was a neuropsychiatrist that was actually eventually called in. And the young boy was fine. I think they got him when he was like 1 year old. And then when he was 5 years old, he just became extremely aggressive. In fact, he was beating up their daughter, who was a couple years older. And it just took intensive therapy in order to get the child so he could actually go back to school. I mean, in the film, they had the mother holding him down just to restrain him until she was exhausted. And then the father had to come in and lay on top of him until, eventually the boy calmed down. So there is a number of different mechanisms that you can use, and this neuropsychiatrist really had some of them because he had actually adopted 4 orphans himself, the family had. So he had a repertoire of ways to manage what was going on. So this is, the caregivers are important. They're the most important people in the society. More important than corporate executives, more important than the military, more important than anything. Just this one-to-one interaction between one human being and another. Because it determines, as we say above, core neurobiology. Now, this is an experiment that was done that was trying to tease apart nature versus nurture. And this is a mammal similar to, for example, a rat as far as brain structure is concerned, which is fairly evolved. So let me just go over this and then we'll show you the experiment. So this is what they did. They were interested in knowing how plastic neurons really are. And if where they go and the milieu and the environment they're surrounded in really determines what they become. So if I have neurons from the brain going to my eyes, what would happen if I took those neurons and I put them in my auditory area where my hearing nerves were supposed to go? What would they develop into? Would they still maintain the capacity for vision, or would they actually be transformed into neurons that could interpret incoming sound waves from the eardrum? So basically, just to outline it, here's the optic nerve. So this is what goes out of the back of our eyeball to the occipital lobe in the brain. So this is from both sides. And then they cross over, so your right eye goes to the left side, the left eye goes to the right side. And the area that the nerves actually grow into is called the visual cortex. So one of the first things that these neurons need, after the baby's born, is light. So this is an incoming sensation. Everything we perceive is through our senses. So all the knowledge we have in our brain, all the theorems, all the relationships come through, the experiences that we're getting. So if a baby is born with a cataract, let's say on the left eye, they have to actually correct that visual defect within the first 3 months. Because if they don't do it, what happens is, these nerves are growing from the back of the eye to the right side of the brain, and the stimulus that makes them grow, just like if I want to do, I want to increase the size of my bicep, I got to do curls, and I have to increase the weight, and eventually I have a bigger bicep or a stronger bicep. So the same thing with vision. And then the light hits the eye, and then the neurons grow, and they go from one side to the other. So they go from here all the way back to the visual cortex, and this same thing. So this is where they connect. So what happens is if the baby doesn't have enough light, is that if this was, for example, the eye on this side and it was going to this side of the brain, and this was the one that had the cataract, what would happen is that this tract, this optic nerve tract, would actually not only grow into this area, but, oops, not only grow into that area, but it would also grow into this area.